Imagine walking into a courtroom expecting justice, only to be met with prejudice. That's exactly what happened to a black woman who found herself standing before a judge who made no effort to hide his bias. The judge, known for his controversial rulings, didn't bother looking into her case properly before handing down an outrageous fine. His dismissive tone and subtle but pointed remarks left no doubt about his prejudices. To him, she was just another person to look down on. But what he didn't realize was that the woman standing before him wasn't just anyone. She wasn't someone who would quietly accept his behavior and move on. In fact, she was someone with the power and knowledge to challenge his actions, because she's a highly respected federal prosecutor. As the judge smugly delivered his verdict, she remained calm. But what came next turned the courtroom upside down and left everyone stunned. How did she respond? And how did the judge react when he discovered who she really was? Stick around, because this is a story you don't want to miss. The twist will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and justice. The courtroom fell silent as the woman held her ground, refusing to back down after the judge's ruling. She didn't flinch under his condescending gaze, nor did she rush to defend herself immediately. Instead, she stood with quiet confidence, letting the tension hang heavy in the air. The judge, clearly used to wielding unchecked power, smirked as if he had already won. What the judge didn't know was that this wasn't her first encounter with injustice. Growing up, she had witnessed how people like her were often treated unfairly in the very system meant to protect them. It's what inspired her to become a prosecutor, to fight for fairness and hold people accountable, no matter their position. But today, the irony of being on the receiving end of such blatant bias wasn't lost on her. She thought about all the times she'd stood on the other side of the courtroom, ensuring justice was served. And now, here she was, being reduced to stereotypes and assumptions by someone who didn't even bother to ask who she was. As she prepared to speak, the judge's arrogance only grew. He had no idea that his world was about to change, and so did everyone else watching. The woman finally spoke, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the judge's smugness like a knife. She addressed his ruling with precise words, pointing out the errors in his reasoning without raising her voice. Her tone wasn't defensive. It was measured, confident, and loaded with authority. The judge, caught off guard, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but quickly masked it with a dismissive wave of his hand. He interrupted her, trying to reassert control, but she didn't falter. Meanwhile, people in the courtroom began to sense that something was different about her. Whispers rippled through the room as her commanding presence became impossible to ignore. She wasn't just defending herself. She was dismantling the judge's assumptions piece by piece. The bailiff, standing off to the side, watched with raised eyebrows. He'd seen countless cases pass through this courtroom, but this felt different. The woman wasn't acting like someone intimidated by authority. If anything, she seemed like someone who knew the system inside and out, like someone who had seen the other side of the bench. The judge, still unaware of her full identity, grew visibly irritated. He leaned forward, his voice sharper now, demanding to know why she thought she had the right to challenge him. But instead of answering directly, she paused and let the silence hang. Then she said something that made the entire courtroom freeze. The room felt electric as everyone held their breath, waiting for her response. The woman looked the judge directly in the eye, her calm demeanor unshaken by his rising frustration. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "you seem to be under the impression that your authority is absolute. But justice requires more than assumptions. It demands accountability, even from the bench." The judge's face reddened as he leaned back in his chair, clearly taken aback by her boldness. He muttered something under his breath, but it was drowned out by the murmurs spreading across the room. By now, the courtroom spectators were no longer merely witnesses to a routine case. They were gripped by the unfolding drama. Who was this woman? How could she speak so confidently to a man known for intimidating others into silence? Her words weren't just a defense. They were a challenge, a direct call-out to the very bias that had colored the judge's decision. And though he wouldn't admit it, the shift in his expression revealed that her confidence was starting to unsettle him. But the tension only grew when she reached into her bag and pulled out a leather folder. She calmly placed it on the table in front of her, opened it, and slid a badge across the surface for everyone to see. The room went silent. The judge squinted at it, his brow furrowing as he tried to process what he was looking at. "I'm a federal prosecutor," she said, her voice carrying just enough weight to make the entire room feel the significance of her words. The judge's eyes widened, but before he could respond, she continued, "And I know exactly how the system is supposed to work, and when it fails." The judge's arrogance began to falter, his earlier confidence replaced with an almost panicked confusion. The courtroom buzzed with whispers again, but no one dared to speak loudly enough to break the tension. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone could feel that something big was about to happen, something that could shake the very foundation of the courtroom. The judge's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses to get a closer look at the badge. It was unmistakable. The emblem, the lettering, it all confirmed what the woman had just said. A federal prosecutor. The very type of person who could scrutinize his decisions on a level he'd never imagined. His confident facade cracked, but he quickly tried to regain his composure, clearing his throat and leaning forward as if to dismiss her revelation. But before he could speak, the woman wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice now carrying a sharper edge, "the bias you've displayed here isn't just unethical. It's a violation of the very principles you swore to uphold. And it doesn't stop here, does it?" Her words struck like a thunderclap. The courtroom grew even quieter, the weight of her statement suffocating. The judge's face paled as the implication of her words sunk in. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was suggesting something bigger, something systemic. The spectators exchanged nervous glances. Was she implying that this wasn't an isolated incident? Did she have proof? Then she reached back into her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "This isn't the first time complaints have been filed about you," she said, sliding the documents across the table. "And it won't be the last unless something changes." The judge froze, his eyes darting between her and the papers. The room collectively leaned in, waiting to see what he would do next. It was clear now that she hadn't just come to defend herself. She had come prepared to expose a pattern, one that could cost him everything. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and for the first time, it seemed like the judge was no longer in control of his own courtroom. The judge's hands hovered over the stack of papers, as if touching them would confirm his worst fears. His voice, now shaky, tried to muster authority. These accusations are baseless," he stammered, but the confidence he once held was gone. The woman didn't flinch, her expression steady as she responded. "Baseless. These complaints were filed by people who stood in this very courtroom, victims of your unjust rulings. And now there's a record that doesn't lie." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the spectators hanging on every word. The judge's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but the once unshakable power he wielded was slipping through his fingers. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice rising in desperation. "You're out of line." The woman leaned forward, her calm demeanor still unshaken. "What's out of line, Your Honor, is using this bench as a weapon instead of a tool for justice. But don't worry, I've already submitted this evidence to the Judicial Review Board." The weight of her words landed like a hammer, and the judge's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. And just when the tension couldn't grow any thicker, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a dark suit entered, his presence commanding attention. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying authority. "I'm here to serve a notice." He approached the bench and handed the judge an official document. The judge's hands trembled as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the text. The words "suspension pending investigation" were clear for everyone to see. The courtroom erupted again, this time with a mixture of gasps and whispers. The woman stood silently, watching as the reality of the situation settled over the room. The judge, visibly shaken, leaned back in his chair, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. As the woman turned to leave, someone from the gallery called out, "What now?" She paused, looked over her shoulder, and said, "Now, justice has its turn." And with that, she walked out, leaving the courtroom stunned and forever changed. As the woman walked out of the courtroom, the weight of what had just unfolded hung in the air.